Good evening, and welcome to our November Behind the Book episode. And we're really thrilled to have you here tonight because we've got a very important book that we're going to be covering. Behind the Book is Caltech's series where we involve campus professors, researchers in conversations with authors, some of them being Caltech professors and researchers themselves, dealing with books that are dealing with current science subjects. By the way, I'm Michael Alexander. I'm the Director of Public Programming for Caltech. And so tonight we've got a very interesting book written by Gaia Vince. The book is entitled NOMAD Century: How Climate Migration Will Reshape Our World. She'll be in conversation with Tapio Schneider, a very, very busy professor at Caltech. Before we get into their actual introductions, I do want to start off by thanking the Caltech Employees Federal Credit Union and the Friends of Beckman Auditorium, whose support is invaluable in allowing us to go forward with many of our different types of presentations, including the ones that we do for young people. So we hope that some of you will look into joining the Friends and helping us keep the programming going that is bringing a lot of young people into the science field. You can get onto our mailing list by going to events, just as you see it here, events@caltech.edu. This book, I first heard about it listening to an NPR story where the author was being interviewed and thought this was going to be a perfect subject for us. It's quite interesting to have ended up picking a date quite some time ago that coincided with the Cairo Conference on Climate Change and hearing the urgency that is being discussed by representatives from the United Nations and many of the other world leaders that were at that conference. As I mentioned, Tapio Schneider is very involved in climate studies himself and was a logical choice for us to be in conversation with Gaia. The issue we have here is that Gaia is a British citizen and lives in London, and we were not able to have her here with us tonight because it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and so we had to pre-record her conversation with Tapio. When that is over, Tapio will be with us live with 2 of his grad students, and they will be in conversation about the work that they're doing and also to talk about the book conversation that that was pre-recorded. At that point, you can also get involved by joining in the Q&A that we'll have after their short conversation. And you'll see on your screens a Q&A icon, and that's where you can pose your questions, and they will be fielded by our marketing and communication liaison, Raul Espinoza, and you'll be meeting him later on. So it is with great pleasure that I get to mention now that Gaia Vince is a freelance British environmental journalist who has written a column called Smart Planet for the BBC online. Her book is her third book. This book, Nomad Century, is her third book, and it is complete with maps and graphs showing how as many as 5 billion people will be migrating over the next 70 years from the equator toward the poles. The book is covering a lot of issues relative to migration and immigration. Tapio Schneider is a professor of environmental sciences and engineering. His research is focused on understanding how the turbulent dynamics of the atmosphere from clouds to large-scale weather systems shape Earth's climate. So with those introductions, I'd now like to invite you to watch this pre-recorded conversation.
Hi, Gaia. It's nice to meet you here and a pleasure to have this conversation with you. You wrote a book, Nomad Century. The Guardian called required reading for every politician and, in fact, everyone on the planet. And the book is fascinating in the scope it spans, from climate science, history of migration, to climate solutions. And it's overall very optimistic in tone. Tell us how it came about, how you came to this book.
Hi, Tapio. It's such a pleasure to be with you. So it's It was born out of frustration, I suppose, because this is a field that I've been involved in some way for, well, more than 1 decade, let's say 2 decades now. And while the conversation has finally moved to the importance of emissions reductions, the importance of reducing our global greenhouse gas emissions in order to keep global temperature down, we haven't really progressed much further in terms of policy. We are starting to talk about adaptation, the need to change our infrastructure, our power systems, and so on for this new, hotter, more volatile climatically world that we're moving into. But what nobody is talking about is that large parts of the world, large regions of the world, home to huge populations, will not be able to adapt to these changes. People will have to move. And I was getting extremely frustrated because we are already in 2022. Our global temperature is already, well, officially 1.2 degrees, but actually probably 1.3 to 1.35 degrees above the pre-industrial average. We spent a lot of time at the last COP talking about keeping 1.5 degrees alive. Well, we're about to cross that boundary in perhaps the next 6 years, certainly by the 2030s. And we're entering this very dangerous territory. You know, we've all experienced this last year of these really extreme conditions, 33 million people displaced in Pakistan in 1 week, heat waves, drought across the United States, East and West Coast, the East Coast hit with terrible floods, Puerto Rico devastated with power outages, the Philippines. I mean, everywhere you look across the globe, someone's every territory at some point has been hit by extreme conditions. And what we're not talking about is the large parts of the world that will not be able to adapt to these temperatures. So that's really the origin of the book.
Yeah. It's terrific. I think what was refreshing for me as a scientist is, I think, the clarity with which you articulated the climate changes that are coming, and saying clearly that 1.5 degrees is a nice idea, but it's probably not something that we'll be able to prevent. And you were saying, well, we'll likely have to live with 3 degrees warming. And I think many in the scientific community would agree that's perhaps realistic, even if sobering. And your key conclusion is people have to migrate. And what I found fascinating about the book is how you wove the history of migration with climate change. Migration is a big topic all throughout, irrespective of climate change already. And the one aspect that I found fascinating was talking about the history, that actually migration limitations are fairly new. People have always migrated. Tell us a bit more about the history part of how restrictions to migrations came about and what you see we should be doing in the future to ease these restrictions.
Yeah, well, excuse me. We are living in a particularly nationalistic time at the moment with, we see these populist leaders. We've just had Donald Trump in the United States. We've got various nationalistic leaders from Erdogan to President Modi of India to the various European leaders. We're seeing the rise of far-right nationalism, even in countries which we wouldn't expect it from, in Sweden, across Denmark. It's very worrying. My own country, the UK, is peddling also a very strong anti-migrant narrative, and it is a narrative. It really is, and that's the origin of Brexit. And this is it's a very easy trope for populist leaders to fall back on, to other these other groups, to when they're losing popularity or losing support, to make a sort of token enemy of either migrants or other marginalized groups within our societies. But it's ridiculous, and it's ridiculous for many, many reasons. And one of the reasons is that we have migrated since our 200 to 300,000 year origins. You know, we're basically an African ape that colonized the entire world. And we did that through these cooperative networks that we forged with each other, and through our ability to have secondary migrations, to the ability to move our stuff, move resources, water, food sharing, bartering and trading with each other, with these groups, these networked groups. And that's allowed us to basically take over the whole planet. And we've done that so successfully, and we've interbred so successfully, that this idea, this ethno-nationalistic idea of there is a certain ethnicity that's genetically belongs to a certain location on Earth is founded in absolute nonsense. There is no basis of these. There is no basis for these races of human. We are all one race. We're all incredibly similar genetically, partly through because of these historic genetic bottlenecks that we experienced in our evolution, and partly because we have migrated so thoroughly and so interbred, even with other species, that there is no difference between us. So if we abandon that for a moment and have a look at this idea that certain people belong to a certain country and that borders are anything other than a completely artificial, invented idea, you know, the history of that is very recent. And until very recently, countries tried to bring people in because, you know, the death rate was such and the need for labor was such that we needed more people. And the best way to do that was through immigration. So most borders are to regulate who comes into the country, which is actually very strange. And even the most nationalistic leaders know that that's not the way for economic productivity. Actually, in our demographically declining economies, you know, we're not having enough babies to look after our aging workforce. And in these economies, which now span the globe, but are particularly prevalent in the northern economies, we cannot survive without immigration. We would be, you know, we already have a lack of agricultural labor, truck drivers, care workers, kindergarten workers. I mean, everything. We need people with everything. And even the most nationalistic governments who with one hand are building walls and sending back migrants, with the other hand, they're trying to get them in because, you know, they know that this is a complete economic disaster. So really my book is about being honest about what we face climatically, and it is horrific. You know, it is very scary. We have left it far too long to act, and we are not acting nearly fast enough. You know, we are rolling out renewables, thank goodness, at a really brilliant rate. You know, we have perhaps passed a tipping point now for solar and wind. It's cheaper now to start a new solar or wind power station than even to keep refueling a coal-powered one. But you know, if we are to meet our commitments that all these governments have signed up to, we need to be 5 times faster. So, you know, we're not doing it. And you can either throw your hands up and despair and say, there's nothing I can do about this, so it's not even worth trying, you know, and be despondent, or you can ignore it because it's too awful. Or you can be pragmatic. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be pragmatic about what we face and say, look, we are facing something very scary, but we have choices. We still have choices. The future is unwritten. We don't have to get to these terrible temperatures. It doesn't have to be a disaster with nonstop conflict. You know, migration is inevitable now. Climate migration is inevitable. It's already underway. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be hundreds of thousands of people necessarily, and it doesn't have to be a disaster. We can manage this. It won't be easy, but we can manage it. So that's really what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. You had a nice phrase regarding renewables towards the end of the book. You were talking about how renewables are adding to and not replacing fossil fuels, which is effectively what has been happening. While there has been growth in renewables, there has been overall growth and consumption. And so far, we're not bending the curve of emissions yet. It will have to come.
And one of the reasons for this that we shouldn't lose sight of is that actually there is a huge injustice here, a huge global injustice. And while we are in rich countries, we are trying to decarbonize our power supplies, our power systems, and rely more on a larger percentage of renewable energy provision. In the global south, many people don't even have electricity yet. They don't have access to electricity. They need power. It's a human right. And it's limiting them. It's limiting development in every aspect, from, children being able to study at night to, hospitals being able to function, all sorts of things. And so they need power. And if they're going to leapfrog our filthy pathway, they need help to do that. And so, as new power is added, it's great if that, is renewable, of course, but this is a global challenge. It's a global responsibility, and they absolutely should be, helped to better access to this power, whether it's through cheaper finance or, other techniques.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, technological innovation and growth is essential to solving this problem. Back to the migration questions. What I found interesting is learning from your book that migration restrictions basically didn't exist even early in the 20th century in the UK and many other countries. Clearly, right now, the economic case for migration, for immigration in northern Western countries is relatively straightforward to make. It has many benefits, and you list many of them. There is no real economic downside, and yet public sentiment right now is not in favor of immigration in many countries. So I'm wondering, what was public sentiment, say, late in the 19th, early in the 20th century, that when there was less immigration restrictions? And pragmatically, you want to be pragmatic, how do we get from where we currently are, which is nationalistic in many ways, to what you propose, which is supranationalistic? You even envision UN agencies managing migration. So what was different early in the 20th century? And how do we get from where we are now to what you envision where we want to be, that migration is something that we manage rationally because it is part of the solution, it has many benefits?
Yeah, so it's incredibly complex, of course. So none of this is simple, but essentially, the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, first of all, it was a time of lower population generally, and huge urbanization was going on. We were undergoing this huge migration anyway to cities, which is something that's going on now in developing countries, and has been for some time. But so that sped it up, and these huge new industries, and people had a very different sense of what it was to belong to. Many of these nations were just forming, they didn't exist before. Nations like Italy, nations like France were fairly young. They'd had a revolution fairly recently. The New World, Australia, was built obviously entirely on immigration. The United States as well was being built in that way. So migration was viewed differently. And I think one of the biggest problems that we face at the moment is that we have had an uncountered narrative that's been anti-migrant, an anti-migrant narrative that's been driven by nationalist leaders and right-wing parties, but has not been countered by centrist or left-wing parties at all. There's a sort of timidity. There is this idea that the populace, that citizens are as sort of xenophobic and racist and prejudiced against people of different nationalities as the leadership is. And it's almost cartoonish. Some of these leaders are almost cartoonish in the rhetoric. But that's simply not true. If you do surveys of people, It entirely depends on how it's phrased and how this is sold as an idea. And I think if people were honest about what we face, you know, if you go to people in a town or a city and say, would you like more nurses? Would you like more street cleaners? Would you like more train drivers? Would you like your shops to be open later? Would you like the pharmacies not to have to close and to have better supply to, you know, truck drivers and all that? People will be, yes, 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 definitely. If you say, would you like loads more immigrants to come? No, no, because I've heard immigrants are bad, right? The two are exactly the same, obviously, right? But what we haven't had is a proper fact-based narrative. So we hear all these tropes that immigrants push up crime. They do not. In fact, crime rates normally go down in places where there is high migration. We hear that they raise unemployment and lower wages. They do not. They do the opposite to both of those. So we get all these narratives. And also, you know, migration has generally been managed very badly, even by governments that have been generous to immigration and immigrants. It needs proper proactive policy with investment, and that investment needs to be financial. So we need infrastructure, we need housing available, we need healthcare availability, schools, all these things for this new demographic, for this increased population, which means we need to plan for it, and it needs to be understood that that's what's happening. But we also need a huge investment in the social side of things. We need community cohesion, inclusion, a new narrative, and education that really starts from very young to explain that people are people, and we all have friends, family, most of us, who come from places that are not our immediate town or city. That investment needs to happen. If you look at what happened in, say, Sweden, which has been very generous to accepting refugees, but they haven't invested in that social cohesion. So we have these segregated communities, these kind of these very different siloed societies. So immigrants don't feel part of the society. They don't feel Swedish. They don't feel that Swedes think of them as Swedes, because they don't. And this separation, this huge kind of social rift, means it's not going to work, means that we get the rise of the far right, even in Sweden. And we need to learn from this. We need to do it better, and we can do it better. We need to build societies of multicultural citizens who come from all parts of the globe, but are united in this idea, in this identity of themselves as part of building a productive new city, new society, new green, sustainable, just place to live for their children, and for themselves, and that does take investment, does take hard work, it does take thoughtful planning and management. At the moment, I don't see evidence of that anywhere, really. Certainly not on the scale of the challenge that we face, and it is unprecedented. I mean, this book is quite radical in a lot of ways, and I'm not remotely radical. I'm very much not an extremist in any way. But I think the challenge we face with climate change now, it demands a response that is not an incremental, stepwise change to how we live now. We are going to have to change everything. It's a huge upheaval. We're changing where we live, how we live, what we eat, where we produce our food, the cities we build, the materials we build our cities from, how we manage our water, and who our neighbours are. I would much rather that my children were not conscripted into an army to fight Yemenis and Bangladeshis, but rather they lived in new dense cities with a Yemeni neighbor and a Bangladeshi neighbor. I would much prefer that.
Yeah, your book has radical notions in the sense that what you hope to have in the end, say even a UN agency managing migration, in some ways taking on roles that national governments have now, and seeing how weak international law has been in the past few decades, it seems far away. And I agree, we need radical change, and yet radical change you achieve by incremental steps. So you are talking about the backlash to migration. As I take the Nordic countries, ethnically fairly homogeneous, and some modest migration, at least a temporary backlash. It might be temporary, but other good examples, use cases where migration has been managed well that you think we can emulate, on which we can build step by step to scale it up globally?
Yeah, so some countries are taking this a lot more seriously, and not on the scale I'm talking about, but they are scaling it up. If you take Canada, for example, it's planning on trebling its population over the next coming decades. And that's a policy that the government has stated, and people are behind. They want to build a bigger, more productive Canada. And these are Canadians. They don't look like whatever you might imagine a Canadian to look like, a Mountie you might have in your head, that idea. They might look Chinese, they might look Vietnamese, they might look Sudanese, but they are Canadian. And that idea that you invest in new migrants and that you try and help them, migration is not a security issue. It is primarily an economic issue and a humanitarian issue. So most people are moving to work, and they are moving to where the work is. And by definition, where the work is, there is a need for workers. So, there are ways of making this much better. And at the moment, we lack that sort of strategy, that coordinated, centralized organization. And yes, the United Nations is flawed. We've all learned that to greater or lesser degrees over the past few years, with some quite horrific scandals emerging. But I don't see another international body that could undertake this mission within the timeframes that we have, which are pretty tight. But yes, we are very bad at this. If you look at the UNFCCC, if you look at the body, the United Nations body that is supposedly coordinating our action on climate change, you'll see that it has been pretty toothless. It's been an extremely slow, sluggish process, which has left the world in huge danger. We're approaching at least 4 tipping points, and these are not things that we can argue with. This is the geophysical Earth systems we're talking about. If the Greenland glacier collapses, we can't just cool it a little bit and it will come back. The same with the Atlantic circulation systems that drive the jet stream. The same with the Amazon coral reefs. We are on the verge of these tipping points. We can't argue with that. When we talk about our borders, when we talk about these national borders, these lines inked on a map, they are our inventions. The lines inked on a map are no more real than C.S. Lewis's Treasure Island map, or Winnie the Pooh's map of 100 Acre Wood, or I don't know, the Tolkien maps. They're inventions, but there are real borders. There are planetary borders. Humans cannot live in Antarctica. They can't live in the Saharan desert. They can't live in Mumbai in a population of 22 million by 2060, this century. They won't be able to do that in this large number that we have at the moment. People can live in Dubai. That's an unlivable place. They can live in Dubai because they have huge finances to build an artificial world, and they're essentially a small number of people is living inside a shopping mall, if you call that living. And, all of their water is imported, all of their food is imported, and that's possible for a small number of people. It is not possible for 22 million people in Mumbai, or, 7 million of these are living in a slum, in little concrete boxes with metal roofs, which are already 6 to 10 degrees hotter than the Mumbai proper. These cities cannot adapt in the way that we might imagine. And you know, for nations, at the moment, this is being dealt with by people saying, oh, yes, it is going to be a bit risky. Well, maybe they should just do a bit more adaptation. And, you know, some are now thinking, well, maybe we should actually give them a bit of money for this. And we're having talks about loss and damages now as well, slightly, but adaptation money is very inadequate anyway. But no one is talking about the fact that these people cannot adapt, not these huge populations. Something's got to give. Yes.
I think that is a huge challenge.
Sorry to rant.
No, I think it is a huge challenge and a real challenge. You know, you were referring to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that was 1992. It basically spans my career in the climate sciences. It's a few years later, I started as a grad student in the climate sciences. And so I've been witnessing and to some degree been part of the debate of, you know, all it takes is explaining what the problem is. In 1992, we knew where we were going. I mean, the climate change we're seeing now is in some ways unsurprising. It is what was predicted then. And then the debate was, or the discussion was very much, it's just a matter of educating the public and people will do the right thing. And I hear you say a bit the same thing with respect to migration. I agree the problem is there. I think it's inevitable. There will be migration on large scales. And yet, just making the case that it has economic benefits, everyone wins. Right now, it seems hard to get traction with it. Who should be doing it? Is it politicians who should be doing the education? Issue there is political leadership has been weak on climate issues broadly. It's not the winning political issue right now. Who should be doing it in first building a broader consensus about what you say, and then from there taking the next step saying, well, we need institutions to manage this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem for civic society, for one thing, but ultimately, this is a systemic problem. It's a global problem, and we do need global leaders to step up. It is huge. I don't envisage that suddenly the UN will become, you know, this workable, functional organization overnight and solve this problem like it hasn't done with climate change at all. I think it will start with regional agreements. We already have a regional agreement, for example, within the European Union, where member states have freedom for their citizens to move around a huge geographical area, work, live wherever they like, for as long as they like. You know, human social tipping points. We were talking a little bit earlier about Earth system tipping points and the problems there. Human social tipping points can act on a much quicker frame line. So if we look at Earth systems, you know, some of these take a while to happen, and then they are intergenerational in effect. You know, they can last. The effects last centuries. Of course, you know, this is your life work. You know, I'm just making a comparison between that and social tipping points, which can be relatively fast. You know, I think we may have passed a social tipping point, for example, on, well, we talked about renewables, perhaps with electric vehicles. You know, somebody making an investment in a new vehicle now is much more likely in many countries to choose an electric one over a combustion engine. But there are other tipping points as well when we think about food supplies. In some places, I think California might be one. In some places in London, we're starting to pass tipping points, for example, with dairy, moving to plant-based alternatives and so on. Well, tipping points also apply to how we perceive ourselves as citizens, and how we perceive migrants as well. And I think with the right messaging and with the right investment in time and narrative building, we can pass a tipping point much faster. You know, nothing surprised me more than the almost overnight decision when Russia invaded Ukraine of the EU to grant people from Ukraine access to the European Union to live for 2 years, to move anywhere they liked over the bloc, and to work, have access to healthcare and medicine. That undoubtedly saved thousands, tens of thousands of lives. Just that overnight decision. I would not have believed it. I would have thought that would have been dragged out. There would have been resistance from some member states. There would have been negotiations that lasted months. That did not happen. And that's incredible. You know, what that enabled was people to use their networks to help themselves. Because people are resourceful, they do have connections. That's how the world moves anyway. And if you give people just a few helping hands and a few tools, they will help themselves to a large degree, but they need policy. You know, most countries at the moment are not supplying the bare necessities of adequate and sufficient housing provision for native people. You know, healthcare access. I mean, in Britain at the moment, which is obviously a huge political mess, as I'm sure you're aware, you know, getting a GP, a doctor's appointment is really hard at the moment. You know, we're not supplying that. That is poor policy. We're not supplying that to native people, let alone to an increased population. So if an increased population comes now, it puts huge pressure on and they will be resented. These are absolutely predictable things that can be countered with decent policy, and investment there reaps huge benefits, as so many studies have shown. And I think we need that investment, and it needs to be top down, but it also needs to be bottom up. At the moment, the only people who really are investing in this way are grassroots, you know, refugee assistance communities, schools, you know, health services who actually serve these communities. And it is not enough, but the will is there, you know, the will is there from the community, and it just needs to be nurtured. And we need to build this new national narrative of, you know, going forward into this century with a vision. We need leadership with a vision of what our world could be under these horrific circumstances, this climate chaos, what we could have in terms of a society, and then we need to put the steps in place to achieve it. You know, I have suggested a new international migration organization that is part of the United Nations with teeth, that would help coordinate people largely through labor, through work. People would apply, there would be a quota system, there would be investment from host and origin countries into this, so that it was managed properly. And you know, people would be given citizenship. You know, a lot of people don't even have citizenship, which is a human right, and they would have the choice to move, which incidentally economists reckon could increase the global GDP by absolute trillions of dollars a year if people could move around to where the work was and move safely. You know, I don't expect everyone to agree with all my solutions. Of course not. That is my manifesto. But it's time we started talking about this, because we do have choices, you know, and if you don't like this, then what's your alternative? What do you want? Do you want more conflict? Because that's what we're seeing at the moment. You know, I mean, I also talk about the possibility of, you know, of turning down the thermostat of the planet anyway, to make it a bit more manageable, all these things through geoengineering. Again, not easy. Again, you know, none of this is easy. All of it requires huge international negotiation, time, effort, coordination. You know, I don't know what the solution is. I think it's going to be a mixture of all these things. But if we don't even admit to people what we genuinely are facing in the climate, which is not a sort of slow incremental rise over the century to 2100 when we finally reach 1.5 degrees. It's not that. You know, we're going to rise up, and then if we're very lucky, come down by the end of the century. That's what we're facing at the moment, and it's quite scary if we're not honest about that, and if we're not honest about the choices, which, you know, which will include managing huge population displacements, which we're already starting to see, then we will lose that ability to make those choices. And that's what worries me.
Right. Yeah, in the second half of your book, you talk a lot about the solutions to climate change in itself. You talk about reducing food waste, changing the way we eat. You talk about solar geoengineering. You end with a manifesto. Actually, I like that very much. The book, it read like a manifesto in parts, and then in the end there was an actual manifesto with 8 key points, including the ones we discussed, including decarbonization, obviously, that probably everyone agrees with, but also making a strong case for geoengineering, and stronger perhaps than I've heard. What could go wrong?
Yeah, well, the reason is that, even 10 years ago, I don't think that that it would have been necessary. Probably it's something that we could think about, but not at the moment. I think that the risk that we face for, millions, if not a billion dying completely unnecessarily or living in abject poverty and misery because agriculture is impossible, because their houses are washed away, because of disease, all these problems of this Anthropocene world that we're creating. I think that's so it's of such concern that it would be an abdication of our responsibility to not even discuss this option that we have. So just for listeners who don't totally aren't familiar with this, the reason that the temperature of the atmosphere is going up is because the greenhouse gases, methane and carbon dioxide, which methane actually, we could, if we just reduce that right now, we could actually affect temperatures now. We don't have to wait centuries, right now. But anyway, what they're doing is trapping the sun's energy in the atmosphere and adding huge amounts of energy to these climatic systems, which are driving these much more extreme weathers, storms and heat waves and all sorts of things. What solar reflective geoengineering does is it's a sort of thin layer of sulfates or something similar that can be sprayed in the stratosphere. That's very high up, so it's not where you breathe it in. And we already put huge amounts of sulfates into the atmosphere much lower down from shipping and so on. They're terrible for our health, but they are providing some sort of cooling. Many people think that the recent heat waves and droughts experienced by China is basically a contributor of this is largely that they've cleaned up the dirty industry, and so they've cut this sulfate, this kind of hidden warming. But by spraying sulfates in the stratosphere, we could reflect back some of this energy from the sun. Which would mean we'd have less cooling, which would mean we would have, we would have more manageable temperatures with which to migrate, to adapt, to do everything. Everything would be easier while we were doing it. We would have to continue doing it because these sulfates don't last very long. We're not sure exactly how these would be sprayed, but there's lots of ideas. We know it would work because it's a very well understood principle, and volcanoes already do it in a sort of very unmanaged way. But yes, so far this has not been experimented, it's only been modeled. And so that reduces our understanding to quite some degree. There are concerns that it could affect precipitation in some areas, which would be devastating for agriculture, obviously. However, people have also modeled, slightly lower volumes of sulfates, and they found excellent cooling effects without the precipitation effects. So, there seem to be ways around it, and I really think that we absolutely need to be discussing this. We need to be we're lucky enough to live in a democratic society. Some people don't have that choice, but we do have that choice, and we should be discussing it. We should be deciding whether or not we want to try experimenting, what effect it has. I mean, the importance of decarbonisation goes far beyond temperature reduction. fossil fuel combustion is incredibly hazardous to our health, to the environment. It's disgusting. There are many, many benefits beyond reducing climate change to decarbonising our economies. That would need to be. Yeah, that would need to be legislated for. I'm not talking about an either-or situation, and nobody is that I've ever spoken to. It would be in addition to what we're doing, because we are purely not decarbonising faster. We could stop all fossil fuel burning tomorrow, but as we've already discussed, that would be also incredibly dangerous for society. You know, there would be many deaths because of that. We definitely need to go faster. We're not going nearly fast enough, and we could go faster. I think this is an additional tool that we should talk about, and I think it's very likely that we will be deploying it at some point. Let's talk about it now, rather than it being deployed by a rogue state or in a hurry without democratic choice.
Yeah, thank you, Gaia. Nomad Century, lots of food for thought, and provocative thought, I would say. And I think your intention seems to be to provoke discussion of issues that we should be discussing and manage rationally. And I certainly enjoyed reading the book and enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tapio. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Nice.
Clearly, this is not just a journalistic venture, but a real passion project for Gaia. I'm very happy that all of you stuck with us for this first portion of the program. And now we're going to be turning it over to Tapio Schneider and two of his grad students. And the voices that'll come back to you afterwards from after they have their discussion will be that of Raul Espinoza, who is our marketing and communications liaison. And he will be posing the questions that all of you could put your own questions in, where you see the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. At least it's on my screen, it's at the bottom. It may be on the top on some of yours. And you can put questions there, and we'll be having a Q&A following the discussion that Tapio is going to be leading. So with pleasure now, I turn it over to Professor Tapio Schneider.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for being with us this evening. As Michael mentioned, unfortunately, Gaia can't be here with us in the same time zone. So instead, we'll have a brief conversation among us, or a few climate scientists, and then open it up for a Q&A thereafter. Gaia's book certainly was provocative and provoking thought, as I said in the end, and I'm sure many questions will come up. So with me tonight are Claire Singer and Dave Bonan, two grad students in my group. Claire Singer is working on the role of clouds in the climate system, and Dave is working on understanding the role of sea ice and the ocean in the climate system. So why don't we start with Claire? Why don't you tell us a bit about why clouds matter and why you're interested in them?
Yeah, so I guess as we just heard from that great discussion, and maybe if some of you have read Gaia's book, it's talking about our projections for climate change and then all of the many societal implications that follow. But I guess what we're focused on as physical climate scientists, and what I focus on specifically, we're trying to understand what those changes are in response to greenhouse gas emissions. And so my research focuses on the role of clouds in the climate system. So when we're thinking about how climate will change, there are lots of uncertainties, and sort of the biggest one we can say is clouds. And that's for a number of reasons. One, that clouds are very small scale processes, and the atmosphere is very large. And so when we're thinking about trying to model clouds, it's very challenging and impossible to do globally. If we think about every single cloud droplet is in the atmosphere is on the order of microns. So we can't ever resolve those, but even resolving just the turbulent motions, the dynamics of clouds is happening on scales of meters or 10 meters. And so we can't resolve those globally either. And so my research comes in building theories to help us constrain models of clouds and how clouds respond to things like increasing carbon dioxide in our atmosphere.
Thank you, Claire. And we can perhaps add at the end of the conversation with Gaia, we talked about geoengineering. There are also ideas about geoengineering clouds. Do you want to say a word about how that would work?
Yeah, so clouds are made up of individual water droplets, and every one of those droplets forms on a particle, what we call an aerosol, a small bit of dust maybe, or as Guy said, sulfate that we emit when we burn coal, for instance. So every one of these droplets forms on a particle, and what really determines how bright or how reflective a cloud is the size of those droplets. And so one idea for solar geoengineering is what we call marine cloud brightening, so making clouds brighter. And the idea behind that is that if we actually increase the number of these aerosol particles, not in the stratosphere like was just mentioned, but much lower towards the surface, we can increase the number of droplets in clouds and effectively make every one of those droplets smaller. And so the clouds will be brighter and reflect more sunlight. So that would be a cooling effect on the Earth.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. And we do not know all the answers here at all, which makes questions about geoengineering, for example, at least interesting to ponder. So Dave, your work is you've studied the Arctic, what sea ice will do in the future, the role of the oceans in the climate system. Why is that important? And why does it matter for questions of future climate change and even migration adaptation?
Yeah, thanks, Tapio. So I'm particularly focused on sea ice changes over the past 40 years and what that's going to look like in the future. And so I think this work kind of really ties into what Gaia said in the conversation and in the book. The Arctic's predicted to play a pretty large role in serving as a refuge for a lot of human migrations throughout the 21st century. And so really trying to understand what the Arctic climate looks like in the future is going to help to determine the success of that human migration. And so what we do know is that sea ice has declined 50% over the past 40 years, right when the record started. We also know that the Arctic is warming about 2 to 3 times faster than other regions of the globe. And so it's experiencing these pretty large changes relative to what we've already experienced here, say in LA right now. And so just trying to understand and constrain what models tell us is what I'm focusing on in my research. And then I'm also kind of interested in the role of the oceans in the climate system and how the circulation of the ocean will modulate climate change. And so the ocean can take up heat and kind of sequester carbon. And so both of those two processes can really ultimately determine where we warm and how much the Earth warms.
Yeah, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Claire. So we are part of a consortium called the Climate Modeling Alliance, CLIMA for short. That's a consortium of climate scientists at MIT, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, at Caltech, and various collaborators around the world. What we're trying to do is build climate models that help us plan for the changes that are coming, that give us accurate predictions, actionable predictions of the physical changes in the climate system that then can trigger downstream effects, migrations, and the like that Gaia was talking about. Our mission is really focusing on the physical science and trying to provide the best possible scientific information that we all can collectively plan for our common future. I see there's already a number of questions in the Q&A, and I'll just turn it over to Raul to moderate the questions, and we'll try to answer them as best as we can, given that our expertise is a physical science and not so much the question of policy and the like.
Excellent. Thank you. The first question is actually a comment, which I want to throw out there from Daniel Dobkin. In the comment, it's just a compliment to both the speaker and moderator for an excellent discussion. Thanks.
Thank you.
Let me, there's a lot of questions here, so let me scroll through here. And you'll forgive me if some of these words I'm not able to pronounce, but you'll correct me. It says, AC asks, or comments, addition of sulfates for geoengineering purposes to the stratosphere, although likely to ameliorate global warming, will cause also horrible ecological damage with vast amounts of increasing acid rain. Impact,
I think it's meant to be.
Impact, I think is what he meant, yes.
Yeah.
It looks like a comment, but do any of you want to comment on that comment?
Claire, do you want to respond?
So correct me if I'm wrong, Tapio, but I think that the sort of amount of sulfate that is being proposed for stratospheric aerosol injection is actually quite small. So I don't think we would see any substantial impacts like acid rain, though definitely that's a concern, something that, happened in the past and led to great policies like the Clean Air Act. But I don't think that is a realistic concern for this geoengineering strategy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there are all sorts of concerns one can have about geoengineering. One is rain impacts. It will actually, Gaia mentioned that it will impact rainfall patterns. So it becomes a bit of a question. You might cool the earth, but you might change the monsoon, and that impacts a billion people and more, and their livelihoods. That is one side effect that will be difficult to manage. And I would say broadly, the geoengineering problems are, there are issues of moral hazards. If you start doing it, it might incentivize not mitigating further emissions. And most people say that's, of course, not desired. It should go alongside mitigation. There are questions of global governments. Who would decide, who would have the hands on the Earth thermostat? What kind of governance systems would we need in place to manage that? And then on the science side, I would say there's something called determination shock. If you start putting, say, sulfates into the stratosphere, it will prevent further warming. It basically holds back the warming that would occur without sulfates in the stratosphere, if that's what you choose to do. But if then at some point you stop injecting more sulfates into the stratosphere, and you have to keep doing this regularly on a monthly schedule or so, if you miss the fix, on time scale a few months to just a year or two, you would realize all the warming that you had prevented from happening up to that point. So if you do this for a few decades, if you prevent 2 degrees of warming or so, you get all these 2 degrees of warming cataclysmically fast. And that's obviously a big concern for managing geoengineering. But I agree, the acid rain is not the biggest worry about it.
Yeah, Tapio, I was going to say, I mean, on a more regional scale, there's a lot of geoengineering things going on in terms of preserving glaciers and sea ice and reflecting or adding blankets onto, say, glaciers to help reflect sunlight and preserve glaciers. But these are often a little bit more regional, but yeah, not as much of a global climate impact.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Raul.
So I think Raul dropped off, and I know, Tapio, you can see the Q&A. So I'll let you choose the next question, or Claire and Dave can take a look as well.
Just above, I see there's another geoengineering question. Are geoengineering solutions reversible? If after we have done the experiment with spraying sulfates in the stratosphere, we find unacceptable unintended consequences, can we reverse the process? Yeah, I think we already in part answered that, right? It is in principle reversible. You can stop doing geoengineering, but the problem is determination shock. If you have done geoengineering for a while, you stop it, you get all the warming avoided in one go in a very short time scale, and that'd be terrible.
Right. But like you said, Tapio, the time scale that you have to keep doing this spraying is very fast, on the order of months, and that's because the aerosols only have a pretty short lifetime in the atmosphere, and so it is reversible rather quickly if we do decide to stop.
Right. Important point. I can keep strolling through. I haven't really read the question, so it's pretty random what I pick here. Daniel Dobkin asked a more substantial question. If we reach 1,000 ppm CO2, we should eventually return to the Cretaceous, which was a great time to be alive with lots of huge successful species in many jungles and swamps. My guess is that this would be delayed by many centuries due to a slow increase in the temperature of the ocean, leading to a drought period before the atmosphere becomes moist again. Is that reasonable? And if not, what would Cretaceous conditions look like with today's geography? Claire or Dave, do you want to take a crack at it?
I mean, I guess the one thing I will say is that, yeah, some of the predictions that the book was made in the conversation you had with Gaia, Tapio, was, really just looking at the 21st century, but then there is this other kind of question of like, what does it look like beyond the 21st century? And I think it's also an interesting question in terms of climate, because a lot of the simulations we look at or work with really only run out to 2100. And so when you start to look at these longer term simulations, you start to see, that there's these really large changes in climate that often look like past climates in the paleo record.
Yeah, that's right. There are unknown unknowns beyond 1000 ppm or so. Claire?
Yeah, I guess just to add on to that, I think whoever asked this question has it right, but maybe the timescale is a bit off. I think the ocean equilibration timescale is quite long. So it might not be even a few centuries, but several thousand years before we'd really get into a new equilibrium.
I mean, the ocean equilibration does take a long time, but you do realize a lot of warming very quickly. The upper ocean warms relatively quickly. One important point is this. Humans were migratory. We were nomads until about 12,000 years ago or so. With the beginning of the Holocene, humans started to settle down, build civilizations, Nile and the like. And that became possible because climate became quite stable. And, before there were ice ages and the like. And eventually we started building city. And now we are in a situation that most of the population lives within a few tens of meters of sea level. If you reach 1000 ppm of CO2, you will melt ice sheets, Greenland ice sheet, Antarctic ice sheet. You'll probably realize tens of meters of sea level rise over a time scale of a few centuries, perhaps, but that submerges most cities where most of the population lives. Well, that will surely require migration, and I hope we won't get anywhere close to that. I don't think we'll get anywhere close to that, to be honest.
This is Michael. I'm going to step in. Raul's system crashed, so I'm just going to throw a question that came from Chris Owen, which is, what's the timeline for the decline of the North Polar ice caps? Decades or hundreds of years? Would there be cataclysmic events or just a gradual trend?
Good question. Do you want to take a stab, Dave? Yeah. I guess the first point is to how you define the polar ice caps. Are you talking about the Greenland ice sheet and Antarctic ice sheet or sea ice? I think if I take a stab at the sea ice, well, we kind of actually know that a lot of climate models tell us that the Arctic will be ice-free by mid-century, regardless of the emission scenario we take. And this is purely for the summertime, which is around September. But some of the work I was doing with Tapio early on in my PhD here was kind of actually showing that if you start to constrain these models based on some principles that we understand about sea ice, the Arctic is likely to be ice-free maybe sooner than that. So late 2030s, early 2040s. And this is also somewhat independent of the emission scenario. And so when you're looking at sea ice, the Arctic is going to be probably ice-free in the summertime in this coming century, but wintertime sea ice is going to be pretty stable. And then if you go to the other hemisphere, the Antarctic, it's actually been a pretty interesting thing over the past 40 years. Antarctic sea ice has been increasing despite the amount of global warming that we've had. And so we're still trying to understand why that's been occurring and what that means for the future of Antarctic sea ice as well.
Yeah, so that's the sea ice. Land ice has longer time scales, so that's definitely correct. And it's interesting to ask what the time scales are. I think the standard thinking used to be it's centuries at least. Basically, ice flows under creep under its own weight, like a blob of honey spreading. That was sort of the conceptual model in people's mind, at least. In reality, of course, they're pretty rapidly moving ice streams, both in the Greenland ice sheet, in Antarctica, that can change quite rapidly. And it is an open question of how quickly you can get substantial changes in ice sheets. I mean, what will not happen anytime soon, as the entire Greenland ice sheet will disappear, but you could already parts of the Antarctic ice sheet, but you could lose parts of it on timescales shorter than we used to think. And that's very much an open research area, how quickly disintegration of ice sheets can happen and lead to sea level rise then.
Yeah, and maybe just on top of that, the role of the Antarctic, the West Antarctic ice sheet, and how it might actually contribute to sea level rise. I think there's been a lot of new research showing just how stable, like wondering or questioning how stable that ice sheet is as well.
Yeah. I think climate has held surprises. When I was a grad student, past climate changes were thought to be fairly smooth, and then we received evidence from ice cores, actually, Antarctic and Greenland ice cores, of very rapid climate changes, very rapid being on timescale of decades to centuries or so occurring, and substantial climate changes. And I think we all have accepted that there still is a lot that we don't fully understand, and probably the climate system is capable of surprises that we do not fully understand yet.
Excuse me, I'm hunting for a question that I saw here a moment ago. David Bryan asks, how about reducing population and GDP to reduce the incredible stress on natural systems? I don't know.
Yeah, maybe try to answer this. I mean, I think the good news is, I mean, population growth has to level off, and we obviously we live on a finite-sized planet. We can't have infinite population growth. That's clear. That being said, I think very encouraging change of the last decade or so has been that producing energy from renewables has become cheap. It's comparable or even cheaper than producing energy, say electricity, from fossil fuel burning. And what that means is that achieving an economy that's low carbon, zero emissions may be hard, but at least low emissions, it may be quite achievable now. And I think that's important, because if you want any scalable solution to climate change, you want a solution that people can buy into, that at the end of this, their life and the life of their children is better than it is now, or at least as good. And I think that's achievable. I think reducing GDP, it's just a hard sell, especially if you look at much of the developing world, and it would be arrogant and somewhat irresponsible, I think, for us in the North to say, well, that's it with development, can't increase living standards further. I think that's not the solution here. We just need to find solutions that increase living standards for everyone without loading the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. And the good news is those solutions are starting to be in reach.
Unfortunately, I think we only have time for one more of the many really great questions. A lot of them have to deal with policy issues that clearly are outside of your area of research and study, and something that I'm sorry that Gaia was not able to join us to address herself. But Ted Iskandarian asks, are geoengineering solutions reversible? If after we have done the experiment with spraying sulfates in the stratosphere and we find unacceptable, unintended consequences, can we reverse the process?
Yeah, I think we had the question before, maybe just when you had dropped off, Michael. Let's pick another one.
Okie dokie, hang on a second.
There's a nice one from Marina at the bottom. Yeah, so Marina asks, is there a worldwide authority that can make such a responsible decision as spreading sulfates into the atmosphere? And I think this also kind of brings up the question of like, where we share these borders, or we share the atmosphere, but we have these defined borders, and what the role that countries could kind of play in determining that. So maybe a bit philosophical, not climate focused, but.
Yeah. I mean, right now we do not have that authority. There are discussions what shape such an authority could take. The challenge is that international law is rather weak relative to national law, and geoengineering, putting sulfates in the stratosphere, it can be done by one country, by one actor, if one actor chooses to do so. So it's a very challenging issue to govern.
Well, I want to start now with just some real deep thank yous to Tapio Schneider, professor at Caltech, to Claire Singer, and to Dave Bonin for participating in this Q&A and their own discussion that they had here with us tonight. I also want to thank Leslie Maxfield and the team at Academic Media Technology for their support that they constantly give us to the best level that we could ask for. And Raul Espinoza for his work in both helping to generate an audience, and then unfortunately, we lost him as a moderator for a bit of the time, but he was there with us at the beginning of it all. Want to remind everybody that you can go to events.caltech.edu and sign up to get on our mailing list. You can also go to the archives and see this event, or refer other of your friends to go and see it there as well. And we look forward to your following up on some of the programs that we're going to be doing that are addressing some of the same subject, as we are right now working on, for our Movies That Matter series, 2 films that are dealing with the shrinking ice cap and the shrinking coral reefs. We just don't have them dated yet, so we'll keep you posted about those if you sign up for our mailing list. So again, many thanks to all of the participants, to all of you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to your joining us for the next event that we're going to be producing. Thank you.